Welcome everybody. My name is Professor Alistair Hetherington. I'm Professor of Botany in the University of Bristol here in the UK. But I'm also Editor-in-Chief of the New Phytologist, and it's my considerable pleasure to welcome you to this, our second New Phytologist Now event. Now I should tell you that New Phytologist is an international journal which supports the publication of plant sciences. It's owned and published by an organization called the New Phytologist Foundation. This is a not-for-profit organization. And what we do is we put the money we generate from publishing New Phytologist back into the community of plant sciences, where we support conferences and things like this. And today, this is really part of a, if you like, a celebration of plant science. And in particular, an opportunity for us to celebrate the work of our Tansley Medal winners. This is an extremely prestigious award awarded to early career scientists. And today we're going to hear from one of these people. This is a series of events, and there will be another one taking place next week. If after listening to the talk, you're inspired and you think, I would quite like to participate, then the nominations and the process by which you can apply for the medal, there are full details open. This will be available in the chat. I should also mention that the structure of the event that we have today is, after I've given the introductory remarks, I'll then pass over to Kai Zhu, who is our medal winner. After he's completed his talk, the discussion will be open to all of you to participate, and there'll be instruction telling you how to do this. But it's my enormous pleasure to welcome as a moderator of this event, Professor Amy Austin from the University of Buenos Aires in Argentina. I think really that's all the introductory remarks I need to make. So what I'd like to do at this point is to pass over to Kai Zhu, who, as I've mentioned, is our very distinguished medal winner. And what he's going to talk about today is understanding forest dynamics by integrating age and environmental change. Kai, over to you.
Thank you, Alistair. So let me start by sharing my screen. Yeah, thanks, Alistair, and thank New Phytologist for this online event. I feel really honored to have the opportunity to share a research topic on forest dynamics that I reviewed in my Tansley Insight. So to set the stage, let me point to one of the most remarkable challenges of our times, climate change. We know that recent climate change is unprecedented in scale. This left figure shows that we are all too familiar. The average global temperature increase over time at the annual scale, and the bottom shows the 10-year moving average over the past 1.5 centuries. The right figure used the same information to show climate change over space, where the color indicates linear regression slopes over the past century, and you can see we see a lot of warm colors. It means that many places in the world have warmed substantially, and the plus sign here shows the significant changes. And note that all showing here are observed changes, and future climate change is likely to happen. There's no sign of slowing down. So as plant scientists, what can we do? Plants and forests in particular can serve as a nature-based climate solution because they sequester carbon, which is the same carbon that is in the atmosphere. We know that the world's forests serve as a huge carbon sink. Globally, plants remove about 30% of human CO2 emissions. And in the US alone, forests absorb 16% of all CO2 emitted by fossil fuel. But why is there a carbon sink? There are two processes that have been discussed. Forest regrowth refers to the recovery from the past disturbances, land use changes, or management practices. The other process, modified growth, refers to the change from the environment. Sometimes it's also called enhanced growth. So things like elevated CO2, nitrogen deposition, or climate change. So there have been a lot of debate on which process is more important. And the debate is critical because these two processes could have contrasting implications to the future of carbon sink. If forest recovery is the dominant mechanism, then the current carbon sink is expected to saturate as forests age and reach late successional stages. In contrast, if modified growth dominates, then the carbon sink might continue to increase, offering additional potential for carbon sequestration. So previous studies have attributed the North American forest carbon sink to either regrowth or modified growth, but with limited consideration on both mechanisms. The issue is that we know both are happening. So here I'm more interested in how to integrate these two processes. And in that way, we can have a better understanding of the sink and in prediction into the future. So on the one hand, we know that the forest ecosystems are dynamic. They regrow and undergo succession after both natural and human-induced disturbances. And forest ecologists have a long history of studying post-disturbance regrowth, including decades of research on forest gap dynamics. In ecology, disturbance refers to discrete events in time that disrupts ecosystem, community, or population structure. So in the short term, disturbances usually causes sharp declines in ecosystem state variables, for example, biomass. In the long term, however, disturbances usually followed by regrowth, where the forest can approach the pre-disturbance state over time. And sometimes ecologists call this succession, which is the gradual and seemingly directional change in ecosystem and community structures through time. So here is a famous example at Harbor Forest, showing the history of changing forests in New England of the US. It starts from pre-settlement forest, consists of old growth stands. At the height of agriculture, most of the forests were cleared for tillage and pasture. And then farming advanced to the Midwest and declined in New England, setting the stage for regrowth forest. And transition to the modern days, here is the modern forest landscape. It's characterized by expanse of mature trees in a state of regrowth. And this is the statistical summary of the landscape composition over the past several hundred years. And here we do see that the forest cover declined, but then there's a strong rebound as they regrow. And nowadays, New England is actually pretty much dominated by forest cover. On the other hand, we have environmental change that can potentially modify growth. And perhaps the most important, most obvious example of environmental change is elevated CO2. And this is called CO2 fertilization effect. So the mechanism is that as the level of CO2 increases in the atmosphere, the diffusion gradient between the air and the inside of the leaf increases. So more CO2 moves into the leaf, and increased CO2 concentration increases photosynthesis. And that leads to increased net primer production at the ecosystem level. And we know this from experiments. So here is many of these experiments called FACE, free atmosphere carbon dioxide enrichment experiments. So what we are looking at are forest stands, and these are man-made, man-built structures that actually pump CO2 into the forest. So we can measure the CO2 fertilization using this kind of experiment looking at the difference between the elevated treatments versus ambient treatments. And indeed, if we measure this, we do see the increase in terms of the NPP, that primer production at the ecosystem scale, if we are under the elevated CO2 conditions. So in other words, if the atmosphere has increased the CO2, we do see enhanced growth at the ecosystem scale. We can look at environmental change using other approaches too. So here is an example of looking at global leaf area index using remote sensing. Here we see that the global trend where the positive shows that the leaf area index has a tendency to increase in the past few decades. And this is called global greening in the remote sensing community. We can also use process-based modeling to attribute the observed greening, which is showing here, that decompose them into different factors. So in this paper, we see that the most important factor is CO2 fertilization, and then climate change, and nitrogen deposition, and land use change. So we have different methods tell us environmental change do happen and contribute to carbon sequestration. And there are many factors of environmental change, including elevated CO2, nitrogen deposition, and climate change. So among the efforts to synthesize these two processes, regrowth and modified growth, the first approach is additive. So the idea here is to independently assess regrowth and modified growth and then add them up. For example, we can use forest successional study under the constant environment to figure out the regrowth. Another example is to conduct a field experiment, much like what I introduced, the FACE experiment, to manipulate the environment and then to measure the growth enhancement. And this can be presented graphically in this figure. So here, what is showing here, the x-axis is the stand age, is the age of the forest ecosystem. On the y-axis is the above ground biomass. So we can see that the above ground biomass drops because of disturbance and then gradually recover. So the bull curve here shows the regrowth process. And then we can shift the curve up and down depending on how much environmental change that actually affected the recovery process. So mathematically, we could represent this as a sum of two functions. So here, y is the ecosystem variable, for example, above ground biomass in this example, and A is the forest age, E is the environment. It could be CO2, nitrogen, climate. And this, the biomass, the ecosystem variable is addition of first process, f of A is the regrowth process as a function of forest age, and plus the G of E, which is the modified growth process as a function of the environment. The bottom line is that in this paradigm, we're going to see the shift, the regrowth component shift by the same amount from environmental change. So the curves are running in parallel. The amount of change in here is the same as anywhere along the curve. So that represents either enhanced or reduced growth. Now, this additive approach offers great value to dissect each mechanism, but it misses the potential interactions that environmental change imposes on forest recovery. Alternatively, we can use an interactive approach to integrate these two processes. The idea here is to assume that environmental change affects regrowth trajectory. In other words, all forests follow a general class of regrowth curves, but enables the shape parameter of each curve to vary depending on environmental conditions. So that can be represented by a figure like this. So again, we have the regrowth curve. This is the same curve as we saw in the previous slide. But then instead of shifting the curve up and down, we can actually change the shape of the curve. Now, mathematically, we write this as a hierarchical model. In the first hierarchy, we can have a regrowth. We can have the biomass that follows the regrowth process as a function of forest age that is determined by the parameters theta. So theta actually determines the shape of the curve. In the second hierarchy, we let the parameter theta as a function of the environment. So that's where the environmental change comes into the model. So this approach can include environmental change that may alter the rate of growth. For example, here I have a curve that might show that the growth is faster than the usual paradigm, or it can change the mature state to which the ecosystem converge. So that will be like the end point of this curve. And of course, you can change both, change the recovery pathway. We can implement this hierarchical framework in data-driven statistical models or process-based models. Here, just I will have one example in here. So in this example, this is a study that I led where we used the hierarchical forest growth model, and this is called Monod function, and sometimes it's called Michaelis-Menten function. It has a shape like this. So the biomass follows the age and grows in this way. And there are two parameters that determines the shape of the curve. The first is the saturation level. So there will be limiting case where the biomass will grow in the limiting case. Then the other parameter is that how fast this recovery happens. So this is half saturation age, and that's the K in here. So mu and K, these two parameters will determine the shape of this curve. In the first hierarchy, here we have the forest recovery as above ground biomass grows with stand age following this function. In the second hierarchy, we let the parameter, mu and K in particular, as growth parameters that let them to depend on the climate. And here we have temperature and precipitation. Of course, we can expand this to other environmental variables. So with such approach, we look into the US and Canadian forest inventory plots, 140,000 plots across 23 forest types. So that's represented by different colors in here. And then worked on the models. So it shows some of the interesting behavior. So what is showing here above ground biomass on the y-axis and the stand age classes on the x-axis. So in this example, in this forest type, we see that they grow as we expect from a forest growth model. In Douglas fir example, this is I think it's more interesting example. We see they grow, but then at some stages they decrease. So we see the dip here. The biological reasons for this might be that the forests located in these stand age classes they might locate in the climate condition that are unfavorable for them to grow, to recover. The mathematical reason for this is precisely because this is a hierarchical model. So we can actually make the model decrease. If on the other hand, we use the model as a regular growth model, it will never decline because it's an increasing function. So we can do this for other places. And here is the model results comparing to observe above ground biomass in North America versus model above ground biomass. So this is, of course, just one example, and there are many other examples that we can use this approach. And in addition to the theoretical challenges I presented, we have to also face the limited data availability on forest age, which is a simple surrogate for disturbance legacy. Unfortunately, in recent years, many efforts have been made. Here, I highlight two examples in my Tansley article. The Global Forest Carbon Database, 4C, compiles nearly 30,000 published ground measurements of forest carbon fluxes and stocks from more than 3,000 sites, showing here, with the information of disturbance and management history. So above ground biomass in that database was shown to increase with stand age in regrowth forest, often with age-specific effects of disturbance types and forest types. And this provides site-level data. Another recent milestone is a compilation of Global Forest Age Database, GFAT. This provides area-based data. It is determined by a combination of forest inventories and above-ground biomass measurements. And forests from different plant functional types are classified into age classes up to 140 years and older. So there has been research using this to put them into ecosystem models, and they predict a limited carbon accumulation in live biomass through demographic changes in the future, which is different from previous studies. One of the reasons is that most of the world's forests are quite young, as we can see the histogram in here. So as they age, the abilities to sequester carbon decline. So with that, I would like to thank I feel really fortunate to have so many outstanding and brilliant postdocs, graduate students, and undergraduate students to work with, and also thank funding agencies, and thank you for your attention.
Okay, Kai, I want to thank you very, very much for the very interesting talk about forest regrowth, and particularly due to the fact that we have a really broad audience at New Phytologist. I want to thank you for making it accessible to sort of the general audience, because it was really well done and very, very clear. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
As I pointed out, I'm Amy Austin. I'm a New Phytologist editor. He didn't mention that, but I would like to point that out. I'm also part of have the honor of being part of the Tansley Medal Judging Commission. And so it was my great honor to participate in awarding Kai's 2019 Tansley Medal. So that was really fantastic. And so I'm going to open the question and answer now. Just a quick reminder, you can put them in the question and answer box, or if you are so inclined, you can raise your hand and we'll go about and try and call on you as we can. And Kai, you're kind of wearing two hats today. One is a Tansley Medal winner and one is a scientist researching forest regrowth. And so I would like to sort of open the questions with one from each side.
Okay.
This one is about the Tansley Medal. And I think that part of the process is, in addition to applying, if you're chosen as a finalist, you have to write a Tansley Insight, which I think Christine has put in the, how did it feel to write that? And what were the kind of motivations, or can you just talk a little bit about the process of doing that? Because it may have been different from some of the other research papers that you had written.
That's exactly right. So, this kind of research started with one of my primary research papers, which I presented in the talk. And then I got of course, I feel really fortunate to get the invitation to write a review paper for that. So that really helps me to actually think about a synthesis of literature, think about the evidence from both the regrowth side and also enhanced growth side, to actually come up with some sort of the framework that what can we do more? What can we do in the how do we advance science? So I think that in that way, I feel really enlightened by writing the synthesis piece on that.
That's fantastic. And so going from that, because I think it's fascinating, this idea that you're partitioning the 2 points and looking at how they interact. And one of the questions that I had was, how does that, do you think that that can apply in two ways? One, to afforested ecosystems. These are systems that previously were not forested, but then have been planted for reasons of carbon sequestration or forest management to increase carbon sequestration. Do you think that the same kind of model, or do you think that it needs to be approached in a different way? And the follow-on to that question is, do you think that the same kind of approach can be applied to other ecosystems, not just forest ecosystems, but grasslands in particular, where there's been a lot of work done on elevated CO2? So that would be sort of my science question for you.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, so the first part of the question, I think that for the non-forest ecosystems where we actually planting trees, the model might need a little bit tweak on that because it is based on the existing forest system and how they grow. So one of the motivations of developing the model is look at forest growth, and foresters have been doing this for a very long time, and the functions that I use actually coming from the forest growth literature. So we might need a little bit tweak on the afforest scenarios where we plant trees to start a new forest. The second part of the question in terms of different ecosystems, I think that's totally applicable. And again, this is just a growth process. As long as we know the growth process, again, this will come from the literature where, let's say in the grassland ecology, for example, how do the grass grow at the ecosystem scale? As long as we can figure that out. I mean, the general idea is that instead of making the curve sort of going up and down, which is a sort of additive approach, we actually make the shape that change depending on the environment. So I think the general ideas will apply.
That's really interesting for someone who works in grasslands as well. So I have I actually would like to move now to the general questions from the audience, and I see that Alistair would like to ask a question. So I think I'm going to hand that over to whoever can unmute him so he can go ahead and ask.
I think I've done it myself, actually.
Oh, perfect.
Okay, so I really enjoyed your talk, Kai. That was absolutely fascinating. And I guess it really strikes me that it's actually people like you of your generation that are really going to make a difference in the future. And I imagine that during your career, there'll be government scientists, people in government who are really interested in potential insights that you can supply in terms of mitigating the effects of I guess, climate change. So I wanted to know, if you were asked tomorrow, and maybe you've been asked already, by USDA or whoever, would you have any pieces of advice to offer them in terms of how things, if you like, might be improved?
Yeah, I think so. Actually, I had similar questions before. So, a lot of things that we do as in plant science is that we have a lot of understandings in the ecosystem, how they respond to climate change. And this is just one of the many examples that we have. I think in practice, we really need to integrate that knowledge into our practice. So for example, this research is more related to forest growth, but I have other researches, for example, how do the plants and grasses and trees, are their geographic ranges going to shift because of climate change? And sometimes they do. If they do, we might want to do something differently, right? Another example, which is a recent paper that just published this week by my graduate students, is looking at phenology, this reoccurring biological events. And indeed, we see a lot of spring phenology events are getting earlier and growing season are getting longer. And this is what we call one of the most significant fingerprints. Now, if you are a farmer, for example, are you going to capture this? I think you'd better do, right? Because the climate is changing. And if we can, then we can take advantage of that, be adapted to the changing environment. So there has been a lot of information in science that I think we need to incorporate in practice.
Thanks so much. That was very helpful.
Yeah, thank you.
That was super. So I wanted to move to one of the ones that is in the question and answer box. And this is a question posed by Hannah. She sort of did a combination, but she says that different trees and plant species will be affected by environmental conditions in different ways. And have you included the species or the plant type in the regrowth trajectory graphs? And also sort of related to that, I think she's asking if would you suspect that you need to have different values of K and mu for the different, depending on what species, the dominant species of the system is.
That's exactly right. So in the case study that I presented, what we did as a group is to look at different forest types. So I have 23 forest types, and of course, redwood trees in California, of course, they will grow very differently from pines in the southeast, for example. And yes, they have very different mu's and k's. Not only that, the sensitivity or the dependence of the shape parameters mu and k to the environment are also different. Yes, that's very true. And I can imagine this kind of difference will also persist if we look at different ecosystems.
And I suppose following on to that with my own question is that I think that would be super important to for areas where there's very little information. I noticed from your graphs, and personally, I work in southern temperate forest. It seems that there's very little information about these trajectories for growth of these species that are quite particular to the southern hemisphere. Do you think that that would also be a priority, that we would really need to have more information about these species in order to accurately predict how they're going to change over time?
Yeah, I agree. I think so. One of the things that I think we are at the first step of getting the global level information of forest age and maybe age of the ecosystem for other types of ecosystems. And in areas like, particularly in Southern Hemisphere, we have little information on that. I do think that we need to expand that so that we can have a better understanding of how the ecosystems regrow, recover, and how they depend on the environment. The other thing I would like to say is that we have lots of experiments. Of course, they are conducted at the site level, but how to synthesize the information, the knowledge that we gain from the experiments to a sort of more area-based analysis. That's another thing that I'm very interested in that I think also that helps in the sense that where we do not have lots of data, how do we integrate different sources of data, right? Observational studies, modeling studies, experimental studies, they are from different sources. How do we integrate them?
Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you. So I had another question from Alex. It's super interesting. It says, how robust is your model to repeated disturbances? So this is the idea, I guess, that is it able to account for legacy effects of disturbances or from repeated land use change, I'm assuming, or also maybe other kinds of disturbances that are natural?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have to say this is something that I think we need to develop more on that. And the current paradigm is looking at the single disturbance and focus more on the recovery side. I do think that repeated disturbance, especially, so for example, wildfire. Wildfire is a big discussion here in California and in the Western US. And in many places that have been burned many times versus a single time, they do show very different aspects in terms of ecosystem recovery. And also in terms of the repeated disturbances, there is also difference, which I think we also need to develop in terms of how frequent or how fast the disturbance happens. So we have disturbance that serves as a pulse where they happened at one time and then recovered. And there are also other kinds of disturbances that serve as a press, which is more sort of chronicle and slow going. And they also will have different impacts at the ecosystem scale.
That's super. So I had there's a couple of questions about elevated CO2 particular effects. And so I'm going to combine them so that we can, but one, Yang Hua is asking that they recently heard that CO2 level does not improve photosynthesis, but it actually inhibits inassimilation and biomass productivity. And related to that then also is how does elevated CO2 affect the proportion of organic carbon that is released through root exudation? So I guess these could be combined to how do you base that information? What do you base those trajectories on? How do you synthesize all that information that come from different sources and different ways in which basically demonstrate different patterns of response to things like elevated CO2?
Yeah, I would say that the framework is fully capable of synthesizing the elevated CO2 levels. But in my research, that's the piece that I have not incorporated. And for the reason is that as you can probably see, the approach that I use is sometimes we call corner sequence method. So we look at, instead of following the trees, following the forest over 100 years, we look at a snapshot and looking at different ages. And the CO2 level is well mixed in the atmosphere, so we do not have the gradient, much like we have the spatial variation for temperature and precipitation. But I do think that the CO2 level, as long as we can figure that out either from the observation or from experiments like phase experiment, we should be able to incorporate them into how they affected the growth into the future. I don't think it does. I don't think it matters too much in terms of in some places we do see a lot of CO2 enhancement, in some places we do not. But as long as we have the information, we should be able to integrate that together with the regrowth component.
So Alistair is, the last, I think that this will probably be the last question, unless there are other people with their hands raised and things like that. But there's a study, Hannah again is asking that there's a study, the Friggin study, showing that planting trees on heatherland didn't increase carbon storage on a decadal time scale. And I'm sure that that's true, that there are different studies that show carbon sequestration and she's asking whether or not it would be possible to use that your models for longer periods of time to extend that beyond that forest regrowth and to see if whether or not carbon sequestration is something that occurs later on or is becoming more incorporated at the landscape scale in later stages of regrowth.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think it hits home the point that the growth process is non-linear, right? If the growth process is linear, then everything will keep on growing. But we know it's non-linear. And again, this is from the forestry literature that usually it's saturating. So it grows kind of fast in the young age. And then when it becomes older in terms of age or because of other environmental conditions, the growth can slow down. So I think in general, yes, because it's a non-linear model, we should be able to capture both in the phase that the forests grow really fast and in the phases that forests are not really growing when they approach saturation. In fact, one of the studies that I listed, the researchers actually used the global level age data to put them into ecosystem, global level ecosystem models. And their findings are kind of different from previous studies where they do not have the age data. What they found is that the forest carbon sequestration ability actually declines. And that's because, projecting into the future, a lot of the young forests are going to become older and their ability to sequester carbon will decline.
Okay. So I think with that, we're going to close the formal question and answer session. Thank again, Kai, for a wonderful talk and also the very interesting answers to the questions posed by the public. And so with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Alistair.
Okay, thanks very much, Amy. I just want to echo the comments that Amy has made. Kai, that was an outstanding talk. And I think I can speak on behalf of everybody who has attended this session. Talk was wonderful, it was inspiring, and an absolute model of clarity and greatly enjoyed by everybody. I'd also like to say, once again, really hearty congratulations on the award of the Tansley Medal. Well done.
Thank you, really honored.
I'd also like to thank Amy. I didn't mention at the start, and I should have. In addition to being one of the key judges of the medal competition, Amy's not just an editor, she's actually heads up the environment section in New Phytologist. So absolutely the right person to comment on your work. International expert and really very familiar with the underlying importance of the work. So thanks again, Amy, for your time.
For sure.
Now speaking to everybody, look, I really hope that you've enjoyed this as much as we obviously have here. If you have, please join us at next week's New Phytologist Now. At that session, we have Liana Berghardt speaking, so please do come. And finally, I guess this is my last announcement, is we would very much like to encourage you, do remain. You have been sent a link which will allow you to take part in an informal chat. It's a sort of catch up, and it's a chance to have conversation online and exchange ideas. The link is, I think, available all to you. I hope to see you again in the future, and thanks everybody on behalf of New Phytologist. Thank you again.